Hamas, as in the last few moments, announced that Yahya Sinwar will replace Ismail Haniyeh as the group's political leader. Sinwar, of course, is the group's leader in Gaza. The change comes after Haniyeh was killed, if you remember, last week in Tehran. We'll have more on that, but this news just coming in, Hamas announcing Sinwar as the head of the political bureau. In the meantime, and staying in the region, US officials tell CNN Iran and its proxies are beginning preparations for a retaliatory attack against Israel. The entire Middle East has been on edge for days, in fact, after a series of assassinations blamed on Israel, including the deaths of senior Hamas and Hezbollah figures. Two officials say fears are higher right now about a major response from Hezbollah rather than Iran. Today, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, you're seeing there, vowed his group will act, whether alone or with regional allies. Hezbollah has already declared a new phase, what it calls a new phase in its months-long cross-border conflict with Israel. Today, it says it fired a swarm of drones at Israeli military targets. And a Hezbollah rocket barrage triggered fires near Kiryat Shimona in northern Israel. Adding to the tensions, the US military is blaming Iran-backed militias for a suspected rocket attack on this airbase in Iraq, calling it a dangerous escalation. 7 US service members were injured. Let's get more on all these threads. And Natasha Bertrand is following developments for us from the Pentagon. So, Natasha, we've heard Iran say they will respond. The question now is when and how. What are you hearing from US sources and US officials as to what that retaliation may look like right now?
Well, U.S. officials don't seem to know exactly what that's going to look like, and that's in part because they don't know if Iran even knows at this point what they're going to do. But they are more concerned now, we're told, about what Hezbollah is going to do than what Iran is planning. We're told that in recent days, the fears have escalated about the idea that Hezbollah could actually act alone and not be coordinated with Tehran in its response. And of course, Hezbollah is just right there on Israel's northern border. And so this could be something very significant that we see from Hezbollah, or, you know, it could result, all the diplomacy that we are seeing in the background could result in all sides kind of de-escalating tensions. It does not seem necessarily like that is what is going to happen at this point. U.S. officials are bracing for some kind of retaliatory action, but they're trying to essentially temper it and try to make sure that any kind of action will not result, of course, in a large number of civilian casualties, that it will be more largely symbolic and allow either Tehran or Hezbollah or both to kind of save face, in light of these Israeli strikes in both Beirut and Tehran. And so we know from U.S. officials that both Iran and Hezbollah have been making some kind of preparations for some kind of attack on Israel. But again, U.S. officials have declined to say what exactly that looks like. I will note, however, that before the Iranian attack against Israel in April, U.S. officials saw very, very clear signs of very large movements by Iran, including the movement of, for example, major missile launchers and things like that into position to prepare for a major attack. They're not necessarily seeing those kinds of huge signs at this point, forecasting something potentially as significant as a massive missile barrage like we saw a few months ago. But of course, they're basically preparing for the worst here and engaging in this very frenetic diplomacy behind the scenes to try to ease tensions even further. So we'll have to see if that works.
Natasha, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Let's talk more really about the growing threat of a wider war in the Middle East. Joining me now is Colin Clark, Director of Policy and Research at the Soufan Group, a well-known face here on the show. Colin, great to see you. Just some breaking news that we've had in the last few minutes. I'm not sure if you caught it. We've now heard that Hamas has issued a statement announcing that its leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, will replace Ismail Haniyeh, of course, who was assassinated in Tehran last week, as the head of its political bureau. What do you make of this announcement?
Thanks for having me. I think the announcement could be quite significant, and it's really interesting because you now see Hamas potentially attempting to bring closer the political bureau and the military wing by having a military leader like Sinwar kind of dual-hatted, functioning in both roles. It certainly points to a victory for the hardliners within Hamas. Some of the other names that have been mentioned, Khalid Mashal, has some issues in his relationship with some of the kind of Hamas adjacent countries in the region, including the Syrians and the Iranians. And so this was likely a move to empower the more hardline militants in the group. It could also have reverberations into the West Bank as well.
Yeah, I was going to say this doesn't bode well because, of course, Ismail Haniyeh was part of the negotiations, we so thought, as part of the wing, the political side, the political bureau of Hamas. And of course, Israel has publicly accused Sinwar of being the mastermind, right, behind the terror attack against Israel on October the 7th. So it begs the question of where does this leave any sort of ceasefire, any hostage negotiations now with Yahya Sinwar as the head of the political bureau for Hamas?
Well, I think what it does, first and foremost, is it complicates the day after, right? We hear a lot of discussions about the day after and how the Israelis haven't really been planning for that. They haven't strategized for the day after. A lot of that is because of the role of Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right allies. They refuse to kind of think about any kind of Gaza governance. This really, really complicates that because let's say the war was to stop this week and Sinwar was not captured or killed, he'd be the individual, representing Hamas there. And there's no way the Israelis are going to do business with Sinwar in any kind of post-conflict governance in Gaza.
Yeah. Stay with us, Colin. I want to go to our Jeremy Diamond, who's in Haifa for this breaking news. And Jeremy, just as we bring our viewers up to date, this breaking news, the Hamas announcing Sinwar as the head of the political bureau, what has been the reaction from Israel to this?
Well, we haven't gotten any reaction yet, but this, I can tell you what the reaction will be, and that is to say that Yahya Sinwar taking over as Hamas's political leader, first of all, increasingly blurs the lines between Hamas's military wing and its political wing. Yahya Sinwar was viewed as very much the bridge between those two wings, and in addition to that, he is also viewed as responsible for the October 7th massacre. In the same way that Mohammed Deif was the leader of the military wing, there's a strong belief that Yahya Sinwar would have been intimately involved, if not in the planning, then certainly in the decision-making about choosing to carry out such an attack. And what this also does is it makes very clear that Yahya Sinwar, despite more than 10 months of war, is clearly alive, clearly still very influential within Hamas, to the point that he is able to actually seize power here in the wake of Ismail Haniyeh's assassination. And what that will do, beyond what I've already mentioned, is also clearly show that the hardliners within Hamas are clearly being empowered. Ismail Haniyeh was viewed in many ways as a more pragmatic voice within Hamas, as a voice who was pushing for a ceasefire, who was willing to make certain concessions at the negotiating table. And Yahya Sinwar, who has been consulted at every step in those ceasefire negotiations, was very much viewed as carrying the more hardline position. So that obviously, I think it's pretty clear what that means for the future of ceasefire negotiations, for how much more difficult it may be to actually achieve a ceasefire. And obviously, this will have tremendous implications in Gaza itself, where we know that the lack of a ceasefire is impacting Gazan civilians more than anyone else, perhaps.
Yeah, and I assume that Yahya Sinwar is in hiding in Gaza. Do we know what role he has played in these negotiations? While, of course, when Haniyeh was still alive, do we know how prominent his viewpoint, how influential he's been in these negotiations, Jeremy?
It's been critical at every single juncture, Issa, because Hamas's political leadership outside of Gaza knew that it could not implement a ceasefire, it could not stop the fighting without the agreement of Hamas leaders in Gaza, which effectively gave Sinwar a veto over every decision that has been made at the negotiating table so far. But now he is empowered even further, because we're not just talking about a veto, we're talking about actual decision-making power and authority. And one other thing that we should note is that Sinwar, as he has been consulted at every critical juncture, that sometimes led to delays in those negotiations because of the fact that Sinwar is believed to be hiding in tunnels under Gaza, most likely under Khan Yunis. It could take as little as hours sometimes, but oftentimes it would take days for the messages to go from Doha or Cairo from the negotiating table into Gaza to actually reach Sinwar in a covert manner without the Israelis discovering where he was hiding, and then for those messages to reach back to the negotiating table thereafter. And so that is going to be clearly another factor in the potential future of those talks. But we should note that for now, these negotiations are effectively dead for the time being, at least in the short term. Following the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, there has been no progress towards another ceasefire deal. And instead, what we are talking about, particularly where I am now in northern Israel, is this possibility, very real possibility, of an Iranian attack against Israel in retaliation for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, as well as potentially attacks from Hezbollah, which is just about 30 kilometers north of here at the border of Lebanon.
Jeremy, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming up for this breaking news.